Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My dearest brothers and sisters in Islam, welcome to the New Muslim Academy. And another episode in our series dedicated to the messengers of God Almighty. Today's episode is dedicated to their message. And when we look at the message, and I say message in the singular form, of all the prophets of God Almighty, we see that it was one message predominantly. The crux of it was just one, and that was to worship God Almighty alone. They constantly said to their people, as God Almighty tells us in many places in the Quran, مَا لَكُم مِّنْ إِلَهٍ غَيْرُهُ. There is no other God besides one God, no other God besides Allah. And before that they would say, اعبدوا الله, worship one God, worship one Allah, there is no other God besides Him. And God Almighty tells us about their message in countless places in the Quran. He brings our attention to different prophets of Allah. وَإِلَى مَدْيَنَ أَخَاهُمْ شُعَيْبًا وَإِلَى ثَمُودَ أَخَاهُمْ صالحا وَلَقَدْ أَرْسَلْنَا نُوحًا إِلَىٰ قَوْمِهِ. Allah tells us about Prophet Nuh. He tells us about Prophet Salih. He tells us about Prophet Shu'aib and others. And He says they went to their people and they said, اعبدوا الله ما لكم من إله غيره. Worship one Allah. There is no God other than Him. This is the crux, brothers and sisters in Islam, of the message of all the prophets of Allah. From Prophet Noah or Nuh alayhi salam all the way to Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, including Prophet Jesus. Prophet Jesus never asked anyone to worship him, never told anyone he was the son of God. And also God Almighty reveals in the Quran a conversation that will happen on the day of judgment between God Almighty and Prophet Jesus, Prophet Isa, where God Almighty will say to him, did you tell the people to take you as a God, other than Allah as a God? And Prophet Jesus will no doubt answer in the negative. He will say, if I did it, God Almighty, you would know it if I did it. So the point is, brothers and sisters in Islam, the message of the prophets was just one message. This is the core, this is the crux. Worship one God Almighty. In terms of belief, in terms of faith, in terms of theology, the messaging of all the prophets were one. Why? Because these are static matters. These are not matters that change over time. These are matters of belief that formulate the idea of faith. When it comes to the books of God Almighty, all the prophets preached that you believe in everything that God Almighty revealed. When it comes to the prophets of God Almighty, they preach that you believe in all the prophets that God Almighty sent. This is the reality. When it comes to the day of judgment, they preach that you believe in the day of judgment. All these instructions that are part and parcel of the system of worshipping one God Almighty alone. It wasn't a case of at one time the idea of the last day was considered real, and at another time it wasn't. So one prophet spoke about it and the other didn't. No, brothers and sisters in Islam. The message when it comes to belief and belief in the unseen, the crux of faith was one. Yes, in terms of the practical laws, the daily interactions of people, that change between messenger, and God Almighty tells us this in the Quran because He ultimately reveals the laws, and He reveals certain laws at a time and lifts them at another time, because God Almighty is all wise in terms of the people, their abilities, their circumstances, and so on and so forth. But in terms of faith and belief, the message was one: worship one God Almighty alone. There's no one worthy of worship besides Him. I love you all for the sake of Allah, and until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.